Are you familiar with this logo? It's the logo of the Heartbleed Bug. The Heartbleed Bug, a critical bug to OpenSSL, the library responsible for cryptography for a huge portion of the web. This bug by itself cost the industry roughly $500 million, among other issues, like compromising the confidentiality of over 4.4 million US patient records. It was a pivotal moment for the tech industry where it realized that open source was ubiquitous, critical, and grossly underfunded. At the time of the bug, OpenSSL had a single maintainer operating on a shoestring budget of $2,000 per year. This led the industry to really consider sustainability of open source infrastructure on which it depended as a critical issue. And in order to try to fix the problem, a number of efforts were launched. One of the first one was the Core Infrastructure Initiative that was organized by the Linux Foundation. It was a multi-million-dollar fund whose goal was to harden the security of key open source projects. The focus of the Core Infrastructure Initiative, however, was very much to prevent a new Heartbleed and not to make open source as a whole more sustainable. So maintainers took matters in their own hands. Notably, Evan You, who leveraged Patreon, the site originally aimed at artists, musicians, and writers, to create a meaningful revenue stream for himself so that he could work on Vue.js full-time. He was able to make roughly $17,000 per month from patrons. But unfortunately, this model hasn't really been reproduced by other maintainers, or at least not successful at that level of success. Another initiative that tries to make open source more sustainable is Gitcoin. So Gitcoin is first a GitHub issue market that allows project owners to add bounties to GitHub issues, and devs then get to submit their work as pull request. It has distributed in 2018 $500,000 of bounties. And what's interesting is it's a whole ecosystem which includes an ad network called CodeFund. The point of CodeFund is to allow open source maintainers to add contextual ads to their open source projects, essentially focused on hiring other developers, right? CodeFund has been making roughly $10,000 in monthly revenue and has been able to redistribute about 60% of those. Open source has also been taken notice by venture capitalists. And there's even a dedicated fund right now called OSS Capital that funds companies that are building their business on top of an open source project. Another really interesting initiative is Open Collective. Open Collective is a startup that provides nonprofit status to open source projects which otherwise don't have a legal status. And also helps providing transparency as to how funds are used. Its biggest success story to date is Webpack, which has reached in 2018 $400,000 in yearly funding and has that increase ever since. It does, however, suffer from a long tail project. In 2017, a quarter of total funds were actually given to Webpack. And so to fight that, Open Collective has created Back Your Stack, a software that lets companies not only understand what open source projects they're directly relying on, but also the recursive dependencies of those projects. That's very similar to what Tidelift, yet another project, is trying to do. Tidelift is essentially Red Hat business model, but for the long tail. It provides security updates, maintenance, and legal assurance for all open source projects in an organization's stack. And it does that by actually paying the maintainers of these projects to do the work. It's a lot newer though, so we don't have a good success story to share yet. Warning ahead, though, all of these different efforts really can't by themselves address the whole issue of sustainability of open source. And that's because there just are limits to what we can do with funding alone. And we'll look at 4 of those key limits. The first one is whether funding actually scales all of the way that we want it to. The second one is whether money is actually the problem. The third one is whether we're funding to work would and be able to fund open source by itself. Would that be a desirable outcome in itself? And lastly, we'll look at what the real value of open source actually is, and whether we're not really leaving money on the table by focusing more on code than on every other aspect of open source. So let's get started with scaling first. This is $100 bills, $100 bill. If you stack 100 of those together, you get $10,000, which is the monthly revenue of CodeFund, the ad network I mentioned earlier. 100 of those, and you get a pile that's worth $1 million. That is the amount collected by Open Collective in a year, roughly, and is also the amount that Tidalith has committed to pay back developers off of the $20 million that it received in funding. Let's compare that to open source developers to the worldwide population of developers. Roughly speaking, we have 12 million full-time developers, about 6 million part-time, and roughly another 4 million that are non-professional. If we do quick back of the envelope math, we'll realize that if we account for $65,000 for $65,000 for annual salary for the 12 million full-time developers and $35,000 for the 6 million part-time developers, we're roughly at an envelope of $1 trillion in wages only, not accounting for anything else for developers worldwide. Now, let's compare that to the $1 million that we're actually spending on open source and put those two in perspective. So if we take 100 times $1 million and put that on the pallet, we get $100 million. Take 10 pallets together and we're now at $1 billion. Build a 10 by 10 square of pallets and we have $10 billion. To get to $1 trillion and watch the truck for scale, we actually have to stack 100 of those on top of each other. And that gives us $1 trillion. If we go back to compare it to the $1 million that Open Collective is giving open source, for example, that Tidalith is committed to give back to maintainers, we realize the huge discrepancy that there is between the money that's spent on open source compared to the money that is used to pay developers worldwide. Let's now look at the second question, is whether money is even what's missing. And there's a really interesting chart here that shows us the percentage of Linux kernel developers that are employed full-time to work on Linux kernel. And we realize that this is more than the vast majority. This is like close to everybody. And so this is extreme for the Linux kernel, but this is a data point that we can see across the board. The problem isn't money. The problem is time spent by developers working on open source. All right, let's ask the third question, which is, would that even be a desirable outcome, right? Do we want a future with charity-funded open source developers on one side and corporate developers writing glue code on the other? And I think there's a really interesting answer from DHH the creator of Ruby on Rails, on this. And I'm just going to read an article, part of an article he wrote in 2013. Part of the reason much of open source is so good and often so superior to closed source commercial projects is the natural boundary of constraints. If you're not being paid or otherwise compensated directly for your work, you're less likely to needlessly embellish it. You're solving the problems for you and your mates, likely in the simplest way you could, so you can get back to whatever you originally intended to do before starting to shave the yak. So basically what DHH is saying here is that there's clear benefits to actually having engineers work on open source rather than rely on someone else to be building open source software for them. Which brings me to my fourth and last point. What is the real value of open source? And now we're leaving money on the table by optimizing for the wrong thing here. So the way we tend to think about open source is we'll look at corporations on one side and open source developers on the other, and we just assume that corporations are using open source software, and that's it. And so when we have a sustainability issue, we just essentially expect corporations to throw money at the project to fund the open source software. And get the developers to contribute more so that the corporations can then leverage that value more effectively and better. In practice, though, anyone that's been paying a bit of attention to open source realizes that the real value, the real strength of open source is in the community and the relationships and the byproducts of those relationships and of that work that happen within the contributors, right? And so in practice, while corporations believe that they're actually benefiting from open source and really capturing its value, while that value is going away with these open source developers, bringing that value back with them to the companies that they're working with. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you capture that value? And the answer is to stop looking at corporations as like entities, but to realize that they're actually full of developers themselves, right? And not only can those developers contribute to open source, they can also benefit from that incredible network and the community that is built around an open source project. And that is how they can then bring back value to their own company through best practices, improved understanding of the software that they use, leveled up engineers, etc., etc. So, in conclusion, what we can say is that charity-like funding of open source alone is not the solution. The real way forward is to normalize engineers contributing to open source as part of their day job. How do we do this? We do this by making organizations understand better the return on investment of contributing to open source. Thank you all for your attention.